a violent death, an untimely death, a missing body, a body not given a proper burial. These are 4 of the conditions that could produce a ghost in ancient Greek and Roman, as well as modern ghost stories. 3 of these conditions apply to stories about Jesus' death. Jesus was killed violently, he died at a young age, and his body went missing after burial. And in gospel accounts of the post-mortem Jesus, he acts in some ghostly ways. In the Gospel of John, Jesus twice appears through locked doors, and in the Gospel of Luke, he vanishes suddenly. Also, in both of these Gospels, he isn't immediately recognizable to the first folks who encounter him after his resurrection. But despite these traces of ghostliness and these coincidences with the types of things that produce ghosts, most people, Christian or not, and most scholars, religious or not, do not usually associate stories of the resurrected Jesus with ghost stories. I want to suggest that we need an approach that's open to hauntings, to see some of the ways in which ideas about ghosts did influence ancient narratives about resurrection, as well as some of the ways that modern folks have perhaps surprisingly put ghosts and resurrection together. And then I'll conclude with a few remarks about how resurrection haunts, even today. All right, so before I tell you some of the ways that the gospel accounts try to avoid linking Jesus' resurrected self with ghosts, why wouldn't early Christians wanted to have associate Jesus with ghosts? So what would be the reason for some reluctance? Well, as in modern ghost stories, the unquiet dead in antiquity could be portrayed as sad or malevolent, thirsty for vengeance or appeasement. These were the sorts of spirits that with the right kind of ritual know-how, the living could get special knowledge, or perhaps compel them to do your bidding. Even if the ghosts of the dead were members of your own family, ancient Romans annually threw beans out the front door to keep them from re-entering the house and disturbing their homes. Associating with the spirits of the dead was generally thought to be dangerous business, the kind of thing that shady necromancers would get up to fulfill the wishes of their desperate clients. And in fact, early Christians knew that they were sometimes associated with necromancy. The Bishop Pionius, who was killed for being a Christian around the year 250, chastised, allegedly, those who would accuse Jesus of having been a necromancer, as well as Christians for practicing necromancy. So why would this be? Well, if Jesus accomplished healings and exorcisms by calling on the spirits of the dead, well, then he couldn't have been God's Messiah. And if Christians worked their miracles by calling on the name of the dead Jesus, they would really be necromancers, eliciting the power of this ghost to do their bidding, a ghost because he had been killed violently. Okay, so you begin to see some of the reasons why early Christians might not have wanted to think of the resurrected Jesus as a ghost, or wanted to dissuade people from that association. So let's see some of the ways that this plays out in gospel narratives. In the Gospel of Luke, this is tackled head-on. Okay, Jesus startles and frightens his disciples when he appears to them. They think they saw a ghost. Jesus immediately tries to correct this impression by saying, "See my hands and my feet," places that were wounded in the crucifixion. See that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit, a ghost, has not flesh and bones as I do. So tangibility, the ability to actually feel Jesus' resurrected body, is a main way in which the Gospel of Luke attempts to differentiate a resurrected body from a ghostly body. And in the Gospel of John, similarly, the resurrected Jesus shows his disciples his hands and his sides, places wounded in the crucifixion, and Thomas, the famous doubting Thomas, is able to stick his fingers in those very wounds to prove the physical nature of Jesus' resurrection. And the Gospel of Luke goes even further. The disciples are still not totally convinced that Jesus isn't a ghost. So he says, "Do you have anything to eat around here?" and proceeds to eat a piece of broiled fish. Okay, so even though there are ghostly elements to the way in which the resurrected Jesus acts in these Gospels, traveling incognito or passing through locked doors, these Gospels really work hard by emphasizing Jesus' physical traits, to dissociate counter any reading of Jesus with being a ghost. All right, so Christian doctrine largely follows this lead. The Nicene Creed, which many Christians share today, asserts that Jesus suffered and died, was buried, rose on the third day, and by extension, ordinary believers also look for the resurrection of the dead and hope for life of the world in the world to come. This doctrine presumes that individual identity is essentially tied to one's body even after death. So even though the words of kind of physical resurrection aren't in the creed, there's a strong history of association in Christian doctrine with the idea that Jesus' resurrection was a physical one. His body was raised, and so too the expectation that resurrection of ordinary believers in the end days will also be physical. So many Christians, even now, would reject the idea that stories about resurrection are stories about disembodied spirits or ghosts, including Jesus' resurrection. But this doctrine does not tell us the whole story. It would be wrong to assume that proponents of the view that Jesus came back to physical life or was reconstituted physically, rising from the grave, were merely trying to work against accusations that Jesus was a necromancer or that Christians were members of a nefarious necromantic cult. Rather, many of the early Christians who did assert that Jesus was God's Messiah weren't so sure that Jesus had been resurrected in physical form. So the idea of resurrection being a spiritual or non-physical phenomenon was a very live idea, shall we say, in early Christianity, and a form of debate and dissension among early Christians. We might think of this as an idea associated with forms of Christianity that didn't make it, heresies, false forms of Christianity, but in fact, this notion of resurrection being spiritual rather than physical, and thus somewhat closer to the idea of a ghost, we find in the writings of Paul. And Paul's writings actually constitute the earliest, oldest writings in what is now the New Testament, the distinctively Christian component of the Christian Bible. And Paul's writings are older even than the Gospels. Resurrection is a key component of Paul's gospel, his good news, the idea that Jesus died for the sins of humanity, that he was buried and raised on the third day by God, and that ordinary believers can hope for resurrection of the dead in the end times. Things that are also very similar to what we find in the Nicene Creed. For Paul, this statement about Jesus' resurrection is directly linked to what those who believe in the Gospels can hope for themselves. He writes, "If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God because we testified about God that he raised Christ, which he did not raise if the dead are not raised." Resurrection, for Paul, showcases both God's power and Jesus' role in God's plan for humanity. Paul pairs Jesus with Adam, arguing that Adam brought death into the world, and Jesus' death was a very special death that then wiped out death for everybody. So ordinary death doesn't do this, but Jesus' does. Although absolutely insistent on the resurrection of the dead, Paul does not think that our current bodies are the same as our resurrection bodies. And he uses an agricultural analogy to explain this. He compares the bodies we occupy while alive to seeds a farmer sows in the ground. And what you sow is not the body which is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. What is sown is a physical body, it is raised a spiritual body. He insists that flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom of God. Although Christian doctrine today reads Paul's writings together with the gospel narratives to understand Jesus' death as sacrificial and resurrection as a physical reconstitution, you can see that if we just looked at Paul's writings alone, it'd be very easy to understand resurrection as a spiritual process, not a physical one. And indeed, Paul's very authority relies on the idea that the resurrected body of Jesus was spiritual. Paul didn't know Jesus in his lifetime, but authorized himself as an apostle on the basis of having had a vision of the resurrected Jesus. Many early Christians did adopt Paul's notion of resurrection as spiritual, not physical, even if this didn't become authorized doctrine. And there's lots I could say about early Christian debates, but I want to time travel with you now to the mid-19th century, where a number of folks actually took Paul's idea of spiritual resurrection and ran with it. And I'm talking about the folks who brought us the seance and the Ouija board, spiritualists. So Paul's notion of the post-mortem body as spiritual makes possible the spiritualist idea that Jesus persisted as a ghost and that resurrection is a ghostly phenomenon. Between 1848 through the First World War, spiritualism was a very popular movement in North America, Great Britain, and Europe. Spiritualists believed that individual identity persists after death and in the form of a spirit, and that those who are still embodied can communicate with their discarnate spirits, those who have departed, and that those spirits can guide the living, those who are still embodied, to live better, live more effectively, and also to reassure the living that the state of the afterlife is a pleasant one. And in fact, spiritualists use the term summerland sometimes to indicate what the afterland was like. Spiritualists thought that spirits were not supernatural, but actually a natural phenomenon that could and should be studied scientifically. And in fact, there are all these societies for psychical research that in fact still exist that we're trying to prove this too. This might seem odd to us, but a 2009 CBS poll found that 1 in 5 North Americans say that they have seen or felt a ghost. And almost 50% of folks in North America believe in ghosts. If we go to the 25 to 29 age bracket, that percentage leaps up to 65% of Americans who believe in ghosts. So perhaps we're not as far from spiritualists as we think. Now, spiritualists were primarily Christian in upbringing, and many of them remained practicing Christians, even though they had slightly different views from what many of their fellow Christians thought. But it means it's not surprising that they turn to biblical texts to help explain and support their positions. Now, for spiritualists, Jesus' resurrection appearances in the Gospels offered comforting proof of life after death, as well as the ability for the living to maintain contact with the dead. Spiritualists rejected the idea of physical resurrection, as I've said, emphasizing that what persists after death is the spirit. Especially popular with spiritualists was the idea that Jesus was an ordinary human, but who had cultivated his ability to communicate with spirits of the dead especially effectively as a medium, and that this is a model for all humans. Precisely the kinds of information that made early Christians work to argue against, defend against charges that Jesus was a necromancer, his healings and his exorcisms, were the perfect evidence for spiritualists of the ability of the living to communicate with spirits and accomplish great deeds as a result. Precisely the kind of information that made the gospel accounts work against the association of the resurrected body with a ghostly body made spiritualists find evidence that Jesus not only returned as a spirit, but that the disciples were able to continue to communicate with him. Were spiritualists just Christians gone off the rails? Spiritualists could appeal to Paul to emphasize that the individual persists in a transformed, immortal state after leaving the body. And they could appeal to Paul's own visionary experiences, his encounter with a post-mortem Jesus, to support their own claims about mediumship and contact with the spirits. Now, spiritualists may seem a quirky lot, but they illustrate both the dynamism of ideas about resurrection, and they show us that not too long ago, folks put ghosts and resurrection pretty closely together. Okay, my goal here has been to suggest that an approach that's open to hauntings illuminates fissures and seams in a given social and historical context. From a historian's perspective, the possible perception that Jesus and his followers got their power from sources other than God helps reconstruct the struggles of Christians to define themselves in relationship to fellow Jews as well as followers of local religions. It also helps us get a better understanding of some of the reasons early Christians fought among themselves. And with the spiritualists, we see that there have been significant alternatives to dominant doctrinal positions on resurrection. From a more philosophical or ethical perspective, the question about whether and how individual identity persists after physiological death haunts not only the history of Christianity, but also broader debates about social ethics and bioethics, even very kind of scientific knowledge about the human. And even from a pop culture perspective, I would suggest that our current fascination with zombies and vampires, think Twilight series, True Blood, Walking Dead, these shows, among many other possible examples and books, suggest that anxieties about the stability of the individual turn out also to be concerns about social relations. If we simply insist that resurrection is not a ghost story, we miss the chance to examine its complex and contested meanings. And if we insist that resurrection is simply a ghost story in the sense of something to be dismissed, we also miss the ways that resurrection expresses concerns about the very instability of the category of the human. Thank you.